Okay, picture this. The air is just thick with the scent of blooming peach trees.
Right. It's late spring.
And these delicate pink petals are shedding. They're landing like snow on the shoulders of three men.
Three men who are about to change history, or at least the story of history.
They're holding goblets of wine, they're mixing their own blood into it, and they're pledging this impossible covenant.
Not seeking to be born on the same day, but wishing to die on the same day.
Liu Bei, Guan Yu, and Zhang Fei. This is it. The Oath of the Peach Garden. It's the sacred foundational image of Chinese brotherhood, of loyalty, of ultimate commitment.
And we have to tell you right here at the top, that beautiful scene, that sacred ceremony, it's a complete lie.
A lie.
Total fiction. It never happened. Not a single petal, not a single drop of blood.
That's huge. Because this is arguably the greatest lie ever told in military history.
It is. But it's a lie that was invented for a reason. It was a fabrication, sure, but it was invented by the masses, by ordinary people who needed a blueprint for social survival.
So it was a desperate maneuver, a way to stay alive in a world, an urban world, that had just swallowed their support systems whole.
Exactly. And our mission today is to unpack why this lie was so essential. This wasn't just some fun story people told.
No.
It was a desperate psychological and economic survival mechanism. We are diving deep into the raw, dark origins of this myth, long before the novelists came along and cleaned it all up.
Okay, so let's start with the reality check, the hard truth. We have to tear down the romance of it all and just look at the bare bones of history.
The records of the three kingdoms, the actual historical documents.
Right. What was the actual documentable relationship between these three men?
Well, the relationship was intense. It was profoundly emotional, no question, but structurally, it was completely unequal.
Unequal how?
The core myth, the three equals, the perfect symmetry of brotherhood, it just falls apart immediately when you look at the record.
There was always a hierarchy.
Always. It was a structure of ruler and subjects, lord and vassals.
The idea that Guan Yu and Zhang Fei were just peers who, simply chose to follow Liu Bei, that's historically shaky then.
Very shaky. It implies they had comparable status or even age, and the evidence just isn't there.
So what do we actually know for sure?
We know Liu Bei's timeline is solid. He was born around 161 CE, and he died at 63. His seniority is established.
Okay, so he's the anchor.
He's the anchor. But here's the problem. We have zero definitive historical records for the birth years of Guan Yu or Zhang Fei.
Nothing at all.
Nothing. And that historical vacuum? That's everything. That's the space where the myth grew.
So history gives us a leader with a known date of birth and two incredibly powerful, loyal subordinates who are basically timeless ghosts.
Exactly. And because we don't know their ages, the folk narratives centuries later could just build this whole scaffolding of brotherhood right on top of the established hierarchy.
But we look at what people were saying back then, the contemporary accounts.
Yeah.
The imbalance is clear.
Oh, absolutely.
I'm thinking of that analyst Liu Bei. He was from the rival Cao Wei faction, so he was watching them from the outside. How did he describe their bond?
His description is so telling. He acknowledges the intimacy, which was, frankly, revolutionary for a military organization at the time, but he anchors it firmly in the traditional power structure.
What were his exact words?
He said they were lord and vassals in righteousness, but as close as father and son in kindness.
Father and son. Wow. That is such specific phrasing.
It's incredibly specific.
When a contemporary analyst uses a term like that, what's the political message he's trying to send? Is he just describing how close they were? Or is he subtly criticizing Liu Bei's organization?
He is absolutely doing both. On one hand, he's admitting, look, the depth of their emotional commitment is almost unbelievable. They were genuinely like a family. But politically, he's pointing out the imbalance. A father and son relationship in that context implies mentorship, seniority, and unquestioned authority. It is not a peer-to-peer covenant.
So that deeply infers that Liu Bei was significantly older than both of them.
It has to. He's taking on that parental, that protective, that authoritative role. It completely shatters the entire foundation of an age-based equal brotherhood.
It really does. So the bond was real, the emotions were real. The histories even confirm they were inseparable.
They slept in the same bed and treated each other like brothers. The loyalty was steel. No one disputes that.
But that emotional intensity existed within a hierarchy, not outside of it.
Precisely. The structure was clearly defined by Liu Bei's role as the Lord. The whole peer-to-peer premise of the Peach Garden Oath, it was a necessary structural lie.
And yet the public imagination just couldn't tolerate that ambiguity, could it? The folk stories needed a simple, clear rule book for who was in charge.
They couldn't handle the complexity of a relationship that was both highly emotional and hierarchically rigid. It's messy. If it's a brotherhood, then someone has to be the eldest brother. Simple as that.
Which brings us to that really bizarre late-stage fabrication that Guan Yu was actually the oldest of the three. Where did that persistent legend even come from?
That is history being manufactured by popular demand centuries after the fact. It's based on these really flimsy, dubious records supposedly discovered in Guan Yu's hometown during the Qing dynasty, sometime in the 17th century.
The 17th century. That's more than 1,000 years later. That's not history. That's historical revisionism driven entirely by public desire.
It holds zero weight compared to the original records, but it confirms the public's desperate need to manufacture an age-based hierarchy.
Why was that so important?
The traditional Chinese social structure is just obsessed with seniority. If you're going to create a model for the perfect loyalty pact, you need rules. Who bows the lowest? Who speaks first? Who gives the orders?
And the folk imagination couldn't settle for the historical fact, which was that the leader was the leader because he was the leader, and probably the oldest.
Right. They wanted a narrative that said, we chose our leader based on a solemn, age-based pact. The whole point of the invented oath was to create structure, stability, and legitimacy for a chosen family.
And age was just the simplest, most irrefutable social metric to enforce that structure.
Exactly. The truth was far more complex, but the lie was simple, powerful, and useful.
What's so fascinating is how quickly this legend spread and how deep it took root, even with no historical grounding. It suggests this huge underlying social demand that the existing society was utterly failing to meet.
The demand wasn't for historical accuracy about the past.
No.
It was for a viable social contract for the future. The audience desperately needed security, and this story gave them a model to achieve it.
So to really understand the genesis of this lie, we have to look away from the battlefields and the military camps.
And on to the crowded streets of ancient Chinese cities. We have to ask, who was the consumer of this story? Who was the audience?
And these tales were mainly circulated by professional storytellers, right? The Pinghua. And they were performed on opera stages.
This was commercial entertainment. It was tailored for maximum popular impact.
And their primary demographic.
The urban commoners, the laborers, the small traders, the artisans, and critically the new arrivals to the city who were completely cut off from their roots.
This is where we hit that massive socioeconomic reality at the time. The urban drift phenomenon. Where were all of these people coming from?
They were the surplus rural population, and they weren't moving to the city for some grand new opportunity, not in the modern sense. They were fleeing.
Fleeing what?
Impossible economic conditions back home. They were, in essence, refugees of the land.
Let's get into the economics of that for a second. Why did the land suddenly turn on them?
It all comes down to a concept called diminishing marginal returns. It's something that defines ancient agriculture.
Okay, break that down.
Imagine you have a small, inherited family farm. The first 5 family members who work it, they get an optimal output per person.
Right. Everyone eats well, maybe they have a small surplus to sell, life is stable.
But as the family grows, you add a 6th person, then a 7th, then an 8th. But you don't have any more land, the total output might creep up a tiny bit.
But the yield per person starts to plummet.
It drops precipitously. You are all working harder than ever, but you are becoming individually poorer every single year.
That's the economic squeeze.
Yeah.
It's sometimes called involution, where you're just pouring in more labor but not getting any more efficiency out of it. The land is saturated.
It's a tragedy. And it forces the family to send people away. So you have millions of peasants being pushed out of their ancestral homes, leaving behind their villages, their cousins, their entire support system.
And they arrive in these massive, terrifying, often anarchic cities. They're facing a profound and immediate crisis of isolation.
Think about everything they lost. Their entire world was built on clan ties. Your grandfather's reputation was basically your credit rating.
Your cousins were your security system.
Your local temple was the center of social cohesion. All of it gone.
In the city, you're just an anonymous face in a crowd of millions.
You have no social safety net. Who's going to lend you money when you get sick? Who backs you up when a local bully comes around demanding protection money?
The government isn't offering any relief. And your actual biological cousin is 100 miles away, probably still struggling on that same saturated farm.
So they urgently needed a replacement for that biological support system. They had to form non-blood alliances.
Simulated fraternal bonds.
With people they just met. The philosophy was driven by pure necessity. Why should we have met before? It doesn't matter. The connection has to be manufactured instantly and backed by a sacred, undeniable promise.
This chosen covenant becomes their literal survival insurance.
In the unforgiving urban jungle, yes, that is exactly what it is.
And that is why the Peach Garden Oath resonated like thunder. It was the perfect, distilled template for this urban survival logic. It's basically the ancient manual for creating a found family.
And we see this play out over and over again in modern fiction because the underlying human need is completely timeless. But think about the crew in Fast and the Furious. Their loyalty is the only currency that actually matters. Or the organized crime families in The Godfather. Blood is just a genetic accident. Loyalty is a choice, and it's a choice backed by a covenant of sacrifice.
So that promise, the vow to die on the same day, that wasn't just romantic poetry to some struggling merchant in the city.
Not at all. It was the highest possible assurance. It was a desperate business contract guaranteeing that, unlike your distant, unreliable biological cousin, this chosen brother would absolutely show up when the city tried to crush you.
Wow. It elevated their daily need for mutual defense and shared capital into this heroic nation-building myth.
That's the profound genius of the folklore. It gave spiritual and historical weight to their pragmatic, desperate social maneuver.
And this template just spread like wildfire. The heroes of Langshan and Watermargin, the brothers of Wagangzai, all wildly popular with these same urban audiences.
Of course. They weren't just enjoying the story, they were studying the survival manual.
They were looking for validation.
Complete validation. If Liu Bei, Guan Yu, and Zhang Fei could form a kingdom based on a non-blood covenant, then their own little local gang of 3 merchants swearing loyalty for mutual economic survival.
Well, that was also legitimate. It was also necessary. It's legitimizing the struggle of the common man.
But the storytellers knew that validation wasn't quite enough. The heroes also had to look like the audience. So they aggressively retrofitted these historical figures with these humble, blue-collar jobs.
They needed instant relatability. They had to strip away the historical complexity. I mean, Liu Bei was technically descended from royalty, however distant.
But they didn't focus on that.
No, they focused on the most common low to mid-level trades, the jobs their audience actually had.
Liu Bei selling straw mats and sandals is actually historically recorded, which gave them a perfect starting point of humility.
An honest trade, but definitely not a noble one. But the others, that's pure fiction, but it's incredibly important fiction.
Guan Yu, the great general, was turned into a guy selling jujums or mung beans. And Zhang Fei, the fierce warrior, was suddenly a butcher, a pork seller. Zhao Yun was often portrayed as a horse trader.
These were the shopkeepers, the vendors, the traveling salesmen of the ancient world.
The storytellers didn't care about historical fact. They cared about fidelity to the audience's experience, to the texture and feel of the urban marketplace.
They needed those specific, gritty details that would make the audience just nod in recognition.
Like that famous anecdote about Zhang Fei, how he'd throw his freshly butchered pork into a deep well.
And cover the opening with a heavy stone to keep it cool on a hot day.
That's amazing, isn't it? It's not just a random plot point, it's a specific piece of professional ingenuity. The audience knows that trick. They recognize their own daily struggles with perishable inventory and the lack of refrigeration.
That realism is what sold the story on the opera stage. It made the heroes one of them.
And this emphasis on their humble beginnings served this massive ideological purpose of upward mobility, the rags to riches mandate.
Liu Bei's faction was always portrayed as the underdog, right? They were struggling against the established power and wealth of Cao Cao's more refined, bureaucratic group.
Which made them the clear, aspirational fan favorite.
Of course.
The audience desired proof that their own straw sandals and market stalls could eventually lead to power and glory. The popularity wasn't rooted in military strategy. It was rooted in the deep satisfaction of seeing the humble merchant challenge the established empire.
So we can say pretty definitively, rags to riches is not a fairy tale. It's an economic mandate.
Absolutely. If the blue-collar guy can become an emperor, then my sacrifice, my struggle in this urban jungle, is also justified.
It provided a spiritual and economic justification for ambition among the working class. The ultimate goal of life wasn't just to stay alive, it was to rise.
Which connects directly to this really profound and ancient concept that comes from the I Chang Ching, the idea of achieving Tai.
Okay, can you break that down for us? What does Tai actually mean?
So, the Tai Gua, the hexagram of peace, it's the most auspicious cycle in the book. It symbolizes universal harmony, stability, and prosperity, but only after a period of extreme struggle and chaos.
Like the idiom, after extremes comes relief.
That's it, exactly. It's the ultimate payoff for suffering. And in the ancient social context, the act of rising from poverty or low status to true established prosperity, that was kind of beyond Tai.
It means achieving Tai.
Transforming your life completely.
So if I'm a struggling merchant in the audience of one of these operas, how does the story of Liu Bei achieving beyond Tai translate into my daily life? Is it just giving me hope, or is there practical advice there?
It's offering both. The practical advice is, choose your covenant wisely. Form your own brotherhood, because that chosen family is your new capital. It's your investment in mutual success.
And the hope.
The hope is that the universe will recognize your righteous struggle and your unbreakable loyalty just as it recognized Liu Bei's, and that it will allow you to finally achieve beyond Tai yourself.
The story just perfectly satisfied that deep-seated desire. The promise wasn't just survival.
No, the promise was nobility and wealth. Because the storyteller's primary audience had truly experienced grinding poverty, their yearning for glory and wealth was absolutely direct. There was no shame in it.
They were looking for a role model.
A role model that showed them exactly how to get rich and powerful through a chosen, loyal organization. It's the blue-collar business model in action. Loyalty is equity.
Okay, so if the refined, famous version of the oath is this noble philosophical treatise, the raw folk versions are something else entirely.
Oh, they are a pragmatic, sometimes absolutely brutal contract. When we look at the raw, unfiltered versions that were popular on the streets, they reveal just how crude the original audience's demands really were.
For instance, in the earliest folk swearing ceremonies, age wasn't always the deciding factor for who became the eldest brother, was it?
Not at all. Traditional practice often recognized the wealthiest member or the person with the highest established social status as the eldest brother, regardless of their actual years.
Money talked. Even in Brotherhood, it's a very practical hierarchy.
And the Yuan dynasty opera versions are astonishingly blunt about this profit motive. In those plays, Guan Yu and Zhang Fei see Liu Bei's potential, and they immediately suspect he's destined for immense wealth and rank.
So they needed some kind of assurance before they committed their lives to him.
They had to be certain they were swearing loyalty to a winner. So how do they test his true destiny?
They got him spectacularly drunk.
Completely drunk. The common belief was that a person's true destined nature, the fate that's written on their soul, is only revealed when their guard is completely down.
Usually through intoxication or a high fever.
Exactly. And the omens that followed, they are so visceral and bizarre, they could only have been designed for a performance stage that was desperate for maximum shock value.
So Liu Bei is lying there, completely passed out, and the other two are looking for the physical signs of his destiny.
And the sign they find is, well, it's truly horrifying.
It's the snake, isn't it? A snake coming out of his mouth and crawling into his nose. I mean, that is just gruesome.
It's pure body horror.
But why a snake? What did a snake specifically symbolize to an opera audience that made this a clear omen of nobility and not, a demonic possession?
The snake here isn't just a beast. It's a symbol of chaotic, primal energy. It's the raw power of the earth. But when it's moving in such a bizarre, deliberate pattern like that...
From orifice to orifice.
Right. It signifies a potent, almost semi-divine destiny that is actively taking over the man's body.
And it wasn't just one. There was the red-banded snake emerging from his mouth and entering his nose, and then another one crawling out of his eye and into his ear.
The snake enters the 7 orifices. That means the entire body, the entire essence of the man, is being consumed by future fortune. It's crude, it's unforgettable, and to that audience, it's an unmistakable sign. This man will surely become noble.
So forget age. Destiny determines the hierarchy.
That immediately secured Liu Bei's position as the eldest brother. It validated the folk audience's own pragmatic standards. If you have the higher destiny, you lead. It's less about birthdays and more about future earnings potential.
It gave them permission to use their own standards for choosing leaders in their own lives.
It did. But even those crude versions, they just pale in comparison to the absolutely grisly point-of-no-return version of the oath. This one shows the ultimate price of commitment.
This is the version where, after they swear brotherhood, Liu Bei proposes a sacrifice that just defines extreme commitment.
He argues that a man with family ties, with a wife and children, can't fully commit to great deeds.
His logic is brutal. He says, brothers are like hands and feet. Wives are like clothing.
Clothing is disposable when you enter the battlefield. Why not tear off those clothes?
The implication is just, it's brutal and psychological. You cannot commit fully to this new covenant, to this grand mission, if you have a retreat, if you have a safe harbor, a biological responsibility to fall back on.
So they agree to this mutual, horrifying exchange. Guan Yu will kill Zhang Fei's family, and Zhang Fei will kill Guan Yu's family. Total irreversible destruction of their pasts.
That is terrifying. It forces a complete mental and emotional rupture from your old life. But what did the audience gain from watching that level of psychological trauma? Why was that essential to the plot before it was softened?
It's ancient game theory applied to a narrative. This act instantly creates a point of no return.
There's no going back.
None. If they fail in their mission, they have absolutely nothing to return to. The cost of betrayal or failure becomes infinitely high. It's success or it's death. The story gains maximum tension and the highest possible stakes.
But there is that single necessary moment of mercy. The fierce Zhang Fei, the cook butcher, he can't bring himself to kill Guan Yu's pregnant wife.
His heart was too soft, as the story goes. She escapes, and she later gives birth to a son, Guan Suo.
And that one moment of mercy creates the entire non-historical legend of Guan Suo. It softens the narrative just a little.
Just a little. But the brutality of the premise, the idea that destroying your family maximizes your commitment to a noble goal, that was a powerful, if shocking, plot device for the folk audience.
And this idea isn't entirely unique to ancient China, is it?
Not at all. We know that in ancient histories, both Eastern and Western, you can find accounts of groups of men who are facing extreme, high-risk, life-or-death missions who would occasionally kill their families first.
To ensure total focus.
And to prevent their families from being captured and used as hostages. It's the ultimate expression of commitment.
To achieve greatness, some destroy their past. Wives are like clothing, but loyalty is the armor.
That's it. It's the ultimate expression of the found family covenant. A bond so deep it must absolutely erase all prior bonds and all biological responsibilities. It's dark, but it speaks to a deep, deep anxiety about commitment in chaotic times.
So by the time Liu Guanzong, the author, comes to write the great literary masterpiece, Romance of the Three Kingdoms, he's facing a huge dilemma.
A massive one. The Peach Garden Oath was just too beloved. It was too influential, too integral to the Chinese identity to simply delete.
It was cultural gospel by that point.
It was. But he certainly couldn't include the crude folk elements. The drunken snake omens, the naked prophet motives, the mutual murder of families.
That's fine for a rowdy opera stage, but it completely undermines the moral authority he wanted for his novel.
So he had to perform a literary cleansing. He needed to strip the story of its grassroots gang survival contract elements and elevate it into a sacred mission, rooted purely in patriotism and altruism.
He had to create a brand new origin story for the Oath.
Shifting the context completely, from a desperate urban alliance to a noble act of national service. And he chose the Yellow Turban Rebellion as his backdrop.
Which was genius. The Yellow Turban Rebellion was the perfect noble context, a massive, immediate peasant uprising that's threatening the entire established order.
So the three heroes would meet not out of personal survival, but out of national duty.
And you see that deliberate shift immediately in the text. Liu Bei sees the recruitment notice seeking men to fight the rebels, and he just sighs. He's motivated by patriotism mixed with a sense of helplessness.
And then Zhang Fei bursts in, roaring, "A true man should serve his country, why sigh?" The meeting is instantaneous. It's two kindred spirits drawn together by a shared national necessity.
They then meet Guan Yu, who shares the exact same desire to serve the state. There's no vetting process, there's no getting drunk to check for omens.
No discussion of sales figures for jujubes or pork. The catalyst is purely national duty.
So they swear brotherhood instantly, driven by these high ideals. The whole context shifts from how do we achieve Biantai to how do we save the nation.
And the refined oath itself is just breathtaking in its moral elevation. Liu Guanzong made sure it contains zero mention of seeking wealth or official positions or personal fame.
The focus is entirely on duty, virtue, and service to others. They vow to, unite our hearts and strengths to relieve the distressed and assist the endangered.
And critically, they swear to serve the state above and stabilize the common people below. It is a complete removal of self-interest. It transforms the covenant from a gang contract into a philosophical treatise on governance and duty.
And the ancient literary critics, they recognized this change immediately, didn't they?
Oh, they lavish praise on it. They called the refined vow the greatest oath in history. One asked, has there ever been such an upright and righteous oath?
This is Liu Guanzong deliberately injecting moral passion into fiction.
It is. And moral passion elevates fiction from gossip to gospel. That is the core positioning of Romance of the Three Kingdoms.
It's very comparable to the way the myth of King Arthur and the Knights of the Round Table was refined over time. The group isn't allied for mere survival or to grab territory.
They're allied for a sacred, noble vision of justice and order.
The novel deliberately set itself up as morally superior. More fictional than the dry official histories, sure, but infinitely more upright and virtuous than the crude, pragmatic folktales.
And that moral elevation is precisely why the book gained such immense influence, why it shaped Chinese moral and political thought for centuries. It allowed the common man's survival instinct, that desperate need for a covenant, to be embraced by the intellectual elite under the respectable guise of patriotism.
So the oath, whether it was the crude folk version or the refined literary one, was always just a mirror.
Always a mirror reflecting human need. The need for certainty, the need for loyalty, and the need for a chosen support system when the chaotic world outside your door offers you no safety nets at all.
The novelist just gave that desperate need a beautiful, patriotic suit of armor. So when you step back, you see this profound cultural feedback loop unfolding. The folk imagination took these real historical figures, Liu Bei, Guan Yu, and Zhang Fei, and it just stripped away their rigid established roles as ruler and subjects.
And then they redressed them. They dressed them in the aspirations, the fears, and the raw economic demands of the 14th century urban commoner, creating a template for survival.
From the desperate need for survival insurance in the face of diminishing marginal returns and involution,
To the raw, visceral yearning for Biantai, that dream of rising from the absolute depths of poverty to ultimate prosperity.
even the darkest versions of the story, where they murdered their own families.
Those were just extreme explorations of psychological commitment, of narrative tension. They had to destroy their retreats to guarantee their loyalty.
This whole deep dive really shows us that history isn't just about recording what happened. It's about understanding what people needed to happen.
Right. And the greatest stories of loyalty are so often invented by those who feel the most betrayed by society's official structures.
When the social contract fails, you don't just sit around and wait for a benevolent lord to save you.
No, you create your own armor. And that armor is the covenant you swear with your chosen few.
So if loyalty is the armor that we all need to survive the modern urban jungle, what covenant are you relying on today? If you found this discussion useful, maybe learned something new, definitely hit that subscribe button. We do these deep dives regularly, exploring valuable ideas.
We appreciate you tuning in.
Yeah, thanks for joining us.